My name is Robert Hale. I'm 72 years old, and I signed something once that I didn't read. 30 pages, maybe 40. I initialed every tab, shook a man's hand, and walked out into a Tuesday afternoon thinking I had just made a smart decision. It took me 3 years to understand what I had actually done. It took me 20 more to be willing to say it out loud. I keep a folder in the bottom drawer of my desk. It's moved with me from one house to another, one drawer to another. I've never thrown it away. I've never opened it either. It just sits there. I think I kept it because throwing it away would mean I had finished dealing with it. And some part of me knew, even when I pretended otherwise, that I hadn't. Today, I think I finally have. I'm not recording this to explain myself. I'm not looking for anyone to tell me it wasn't my fault, or that I couldn't have known, or that these things happen to smart people too. All of that is probably true. None of it changes what's in that folder. None of it gives back what I handed over in about 4 minutes on an afternoon when I was in too much of a hurry to sit still and read. This is just me saying it, finally, out loud. Before I run out of time to say it at all. The business started in the spare room of my first house, a folding table I borrowed from my mother-in-law and never returned, a phone that rang maybe twice a day in the beginning. 4 years of work that I can only describe as the kind of work you do when something feels personal, when the outcome matters to you in a way that goes beyond money because you built the thing with your own hands and your own name is on the door. I was proud of it, quietly proud, the kind of proud you don't say out loud because you're afraid saying it will somehow undo it. And then I met Dennis Carr. Dennis was confident in the way certain men are confident, not loud about it, just settled into it, like it was a coat he'd been wearing so long he'd forgotten it was there. He knew a little more than you did about every room he walked into. Or he made you feel that way, which I've come to understand is a different thing entirely, though it took me longer than it should have to see the difference. We had maybe 9 months of dinners and phone calls and conversations where he made me feel like this partnership was the next logical step. Like I'd been building something good and he was going to help me build something better. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, which is a different thing. And I think I knew even then that those two things weren't quite the same. The lawyer's name was Gerald. The office had one of those overhead lights that buzzed faintly, the kind you stop noticing after a while, but that never really goes away. Gerald spoke fast. The way people speak when they've explained the same thing 100 times and stopped caring whether you follow. There was a stack of documents on the table, 30 pages, maybe 40. Yellow sticky tabs everywhere, little arrows pointing to lines where I needed to initial, lines where I needed to sign. I had a meeting at 3. My daughter had a recital that evening. I told myself I'd read everything later, that this was just a formality, that Gerald would have flagged anything worth worrying about. That Dennis was a good man, and a handshake still meant something. I initialed every tab. I signed every line. I shook Gerald's hand, then Dennis's hand, and I walked out into a Tuesday afternoon telling myself I had just made a smart decision. I never read it later. The first year was easy enough to misread as good. Dennis brought in a client I never could have reached on my own. He showed up to meetings prepared. He had a kind of energy that made rooms feel more serious, more purposeful. I told my wife Carol that I thought the partnership was working. She smiled and said she hoped so. Carol has always had a way of saying things with her eyes that her mouth doesn't quite finish. I've learned over 44 years to pay attention to that. Back then, I was still learning. The second year, things began to shift. Not suddenly. That's the thing nobody tells you about losing something slowly. It doesn't arrive with a sound. It arrives in silences. Decisions made before you walked into the room. Vendors you'd worked with for years quietly replaced. A meeting you weren't told about until it was already over. And then one afternoon, I came back from a conference in Atlanta to find that Mee was gone. Mee had been with me since nearly the beginning. She knew the business almost as well as I did. She knew which clients needed a call on a Friday afternoon, and which ones needed to be left alone until Monday. She knew where everything was, not just physically, but in the way that only someone who has cared about something for years can know where things are. Her desk had been cleared out while I was away. Dennis said it was a business decision. He said it calmly, cleanly, the way you say something when you know the other person cannot undo it. I stood in the doorway of that empty office for a long moment. The clean desk, the bare walls where she'd had a small calendar and a photograph of her grandchildren. Then I went and got a cup of coffee. I've thought about that cup of coffee more times than I can count, not because of what it meant, because of what it didn't mean. Because I stood in a doorway looking at the absence of someone I valued, someone whose leaving I should have fought. And instead I walked to the break room and I poured myself a cup of coffee, and I told myself there would be a better moment to address it. There wasn't a better moment, I never addressed it. I sent Mee a card. I think I put a gift card in it, something from a restaurant she probably never went to. That was all I did. By the third year, I was spending more time defending decisions I hadn't made than making my own. My new attorney, I had a new one by then, sat across from me with the original agreement open on his desk. He put his finger on a paragraph near the back. A paragraph about operational authority under certain financial conditions. We had hit a slow quarter. That was the condition. He didn't say anything for a moment after he pointed to it. Then he said quietly, the way people speak when the news isn't good and they've been in this position before, "Robert, this is going to be difficult to argue around." I looked at the paragraph. Then I looked at my initials just below it. My own handwriting. The little loop on the R, the way I've written it since I was a boy, the way my third-grade teacher showed me, and it just stayed. I sat there and I thought about Gerald's buzzing light. I thought about the yellow sticky tabs. I thought about my 3 o'clock meeting and my daughter's recital, and the way I'd told myself there would be time to read it all properly later. She had stumbled in the middle of her piece that evening and kept playing. Didn't stop, didn't look up, just found her place again and kept going. I was so proud of her for that. I still am. And I had been in such a hurry to get there that I had handed over something I'd spent 4 years building without once sitting still long enough to understand what I was agreeing to. The business came apart over the following 18 months, not dramatically. There was no single moment, no confrontation I can point to and say that was the day. It was a slow unwinding, a series of small surrenders, a legal process that was expensive in ways that went well beyond money. The kind of expensive that follows you into sleep, that sits across from you at the dinner table. That makes your wife reach for your hand, sometimes in the middle of the night, without either of you saying anything. Carol never said "I told you so," not once. I don't know what I would have done if she had. I don't know what I deserved. The business that had my name on the door closed on a Friday in November. I drove past it about a week later. There was already a sign in the window for something else. A tax preparation office, I think. The door I had painted myself was still the same door, just a different name on it now. I kept driving. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down even. I just looked at it as I passed and then looked back at the road ahead and kept going. I think about that sometimes, the keeping going, how practiced we get at it. How it can look like strength from the outside and feel like something else entirely from the inside. Carol asked me once, a few years after everything settled, whether I blamed Dennis. I sat with the question for a while before I answered. I said no, and I meant it, mostly. Dennis did what Dennis was going to do. The agreement let him do it. I gave him that agreement. I sat across from a lawyer who was paid to explain things to me, and I chose the yellow sticky tabs over the actual words. I chose the image of a man who already understood over the reality of a man who needed more time. I was afraid of looking like I didn't know what I was doing. I lost something real to protect an image of myself that nobody in that room was even paying attention to. That's the part I keep returning to. Not Dennis, not Gerald, not the specific language in the paragraph my second attorney pointed to. The image. All my life I've carried this need to appear like I was keeping up. Like whatever was being placed in front of me, I'd seen it before. I was comfortable. I was fine. It's the kind of thing that gets built into you when you grow up without much. When you watch your father work himself to the edge of himself and still come up short. When you learn early that looking capable is sometimes the only currency you have in a room full of people who seem to have started with more. So I learned to nod. I got very good at nodding. And that nod in that conference room on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon cost me more than I have ever sat down and fully calculated. I want to be honest about something else too. It wasn't just that one afternoon. That's the story I told myself for a long time, that it all came down to 30 pages I didn't read, and a lawyer who talked too fast, and a man I trusted too quickly. And all of that is true. But the habit was older than Dennis Carr. It was older than that conference room and those yellow tabs. I had been nodding through things I didn't fully understand for most of my adult life. Conversations I half followed. Decisions I agreed to because disagreeing felt like exposing something. Rooms I stayed quiet in because asking questions felt like admitting I didn't already belong there. The partnership agreement was just the place where the habit finally had a price tag I couldn't ignore. I've had a good life. I want to say that clearly. Carol and I have been married 44 years. Our daughter, the one who kept playing through the stumble, is a physician now. Our son builds furniture by hand in a workshop behind his house and seems genuinely, quietly happy, which is something I spent most of my life not quite understanding how to be. I rebuilt after. Smaller, more careful. I learned to read things before I signed them. I learned to ask questions even when I was sure the question would mark me as someone who didn't already know the answer. I learned, slowly and not without difficulty, that understanding something slowly is better than misunderstanding it quickly and spending years paying for the difference. But there's a version of my life where I read those papers on a Sunday morning at my kitchen table, Carol in the other room. A cup of coffee going cold next to me because I kept stopping to reread sentences that didn't sit right. That version of me asks Gerald to explain the operational authority clause. That version of me takes a week before he signs. That version of me still has his name on that door. I can see that version very clearly. He's not smarter than me. He's not braver. He just wasn't in a hurry. He just believed that slowing down to understand something was worth more than the 30 minutes he would have lost pretending he already did. I'm 72 years old. I have a folder in the bottom drawer of my desk that I have moved from house to house for 6 years and never opened. I think I'll open it tonight. Not to read it again. I know what's in it. I know every clause now, a decade too late, in the way you learn the rules of a game after you've already lost. I'll open it because keeping it closed has started to feel like the same habit, the same avoidance, the same choosing not to look directly at a thing because looking at it directly might cost me something. I've paid that cost too many times already. Making peace with something doesn't mean you stop feeling the weight of it. It just means you stop pretending the weight isn't there. Robert Hale, 72. Sitting alone in a room. Finally saying out loud what he should have said to himself 30 years ago in a conference room with a buzzing light and a stack of papers and more than enough time to slow down. If only he had believed he was allowed to. I was allowed to. I just didn't know it then. If you've stayed with me this long, I imagine something in here found a place to land. Maybe it wasn't a contract. Maybe it was a conversation you nodded through, or a decision you agreed to before you understood it, or a room you stayed quiet in because speaking up felt like too much to risk. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I'm just asking you to sit with it for a moment. That's all I ever needed someone to ask me. Take your time.